Hey guys, welcome to Ask Us Anything About the Crusades, also known as Coffee and the Crusades, here on the Real Crusades History channel, live streaming channel. Welcome everybody. Sorry about last week. I apologize about missing, I guess the last 2 weeks I've missed, so apologize for that. But here we are today. So it is Tuesday, so it's time to talk about some Crusades history and medieval history. And we have our very special guest here with us, Dr. Helena Schrader. It's always fun to have her along. So, Helena, how are you doing? Thanks for being here.
Great. Glad to be here. Thanks.
All right, guys. So it's good to have Helena here, and hope everybody is having a good week so far. It's really rainy and kind of gloomy here, as you can see. Normally, my studio is a little bit brighter than this, but I'll bet it's bright and sunny where you are, though, Helena, right?
It is. It's hot and sunny. Yeah.
It's kind of always that way. Helena lives in Greece, which is
we do have the rainy season, basically from mid-October till about mid-March. Let's say you have periodic rains, but never steady rains.
All right. So okay. Guys. So let us know what your questions are. As ever. The format for this little live stream we do is just audience driven. So you guys come up with questions you have, and we will address those and discuss them. And just to start us off here, I've been kind of trying to get the word out about Helena's excellent book, which is already getting quite a bit of good press. That is The Holy Land in the Era of the Crusades, Kingdoms at the Crossroads of Civilizations. And this is a really good, just basic history of the Crusader states, which we really haven't had that very often. We haven't had that exact type of book yet. And so that's why this is a really good contribution. So guys, do check it out. There's a link in the description below where you can pick it up on Amazon. So yeah, Helena, are you planning on writing any other stuff about the Crusades?
Or well, the publisher of this book, which is Pen and Sword in the UK, commissioned me at the same time they gave me this one, a book for a series they do on women, and they asked me to write on the women in Outremer. And I was a little bit reluctant because I'm not somebody who normally focuses exclusively on women. My entire life, I have felt that you shouldn't isolate women or any race from the others, that we should try to integrate everything and look at history holistically. That's the way we live. We don't live in categories and in boxes. But it's hard to resist an offer, a commission and an advance. So I broke down and I agreed to write it, and I had fun doing it because it made me look at the sources differently. We don't have different sources for the women. You go to the same sources all of the primary sources, all the secondary sources, you're using exactly the same sources, but you focus on what did they say about the women, which tends to be peripheral. And then when you start pulling it together, it does give you a different view. So I have to say, I learned a lot. I learned that there is a value to doing this, and I enjoy doing it. It's not earth shaking, as I say, I'm using the same sources. What I think came across to me strongest, if I was to emphasize, is the importance of women as the mortar of this society, because almost all the men who settled in the Crusader states were either widowers or bachelors. They married local girls, which means the second generation has one mother who has a mother who was Orthodox and maybe who's speaking Arabic or Armenian or Syriac or something other than French. And that means that's why, of course, they were then called poulains by the Crusaders and were sort of looked down on, because there was this going native going on very from the very start. But also second and third and fourth generations of Crusaders. I mean, throughout when they settle, they may be marrying the daughters who are half native and half Frankish, but they're still marrying the girls that have grown up in that environment and are already sensitized to the different cultures and different languages and situation there. So I think that the role of women, sort of the invisible role of women as the mortar of the society and as the people acclimatizing the men who are coming and settling there, was something I hadn't looked at until I did this book. And I do think it's an important thing to keep in mind.
Yeah, that'll be a really good book once you've got that out. And I understand what you're saying. I mean, it's that was a huge part of the settling in process in the Crusader states. I mean, Fulcher of Chartres famously talks about that, like about having a daughter-in-law from, who is maybe Arab, or a wife who is Greek. I mean, this is kind of an important thing to help us understand the Crusader states in general, I think, is that this was not just a like colonial type of enterprise the way it's always thought of. This was a joint project between the Eastern Christian cultures and the Latin Christians who were coming there. I mean, this, the Eastern Christians are kind of often the invisible force that was so important to the structuring and the building of the Crusader states that's often just not even, or traditionally wasn't addressed by, traditional historians for a long time. I think that's starting to change, thankfully. So that's good.
Yeah, it is, because they're starting to use the Armenian, the Syriac sources as primary sources. I love Tybalt's book about the armies of the Crusades, which I think is poorly titled because it's really about the armies of the Crusader states. But he emphasizes that the majority of the troops fighting for the Crusader states are locals, are natives. Mm-hmm. They're not Frankish knights. Frankish knights, are like the elite force, but the bulk of course, the mounted archers and the most of the infantry are native troops. Vitally important to the survival of these states.
Yeah, which makes sense. I mean, there was always a shortage of Westerners in these regions, and most of the people living in these places would have been native in some way anyway. So the Armenians had their own military tradition, the Arabs had their own military traditions. So it does make sense that this would have been, how the armies were structured. So,
well, it's fascinating. I mean, the tactics, there's some very good articles about that too. The tactics and the way the armies are organized in the Latin East are very, very different from the way they are in contemporary Western Europe. They had to adapt to a different environment. Wide open spaces. There's not a lot of forests. There's not a lot of gullies. There are not rivers everywhere. You have to be able to go, as at Hattin, go from one place with water to another. In Western Europe, you don't have. It's pouring rain half the time. Right. For God's sake, you don't have to worry about water.
Yeah.
Fighting in the Near East was a very different thing, which is why there were masses of mounted cavalry. This is why they evolved. Very unique tactics, the fighting box. They develop the use of mounted archers themselves. So they use a combination of heavy cavalry and light cavalry, which goes on. I'm sorry, if Rand was here, we could go on about how that reappears throughout history. They both have different functions. They have different values. And the Crusader states adapt all these things, and they created a very effective fighting force, highly disciplined. Even not just the Templars and the Hospitallers, but even the secular knights and troops were disciplined. But it depended on infantry, and it depended on the knights, sergeants, infantry, mounted archers. They had different branches, and the manpower that was provided for the infantry came from the native communities, and the mounted archers came from the native communities.
All right, so let's jump into some questions here. Chris has the first one up here, and he says, was it a mistake for the Byzantine Empire to let the Latins have trading privileges in the empire?
No idea.
Interesting question.
I guess very interesting question. It's a good question.
It kind of depends on what you even mean by mistake. I mean, was it damaging to the Byzantine Empire in the long term? I mean, I think what comes to mind for me with that is when the Normans were on the verge of conquering a substantial portion of Greece, the Byzantines were able to save or stop that by giving the Venetians very lavish trading privileges. And the Venetians then defeated the Norman navy. This was like, when Robert Guiscard was attacking Alexius Comnenus. And that was crucial to that victory. I think it kind of just tells you the Byzantine Empire was so dependent on mercenaries. And Yeah, mercenary forces. The army was itself mostly, made up of Latin Christians and Turks and things like that. So I think the Byzantine Empire was really in a situation at that point where it had to do things like that. It's kind of my understanding.
My first thought is it's never bad to have trade. Trade tends to enrich all parties.
Right.
There were trading concessions to the Latins, the Italians in Alexandria and in Cairo and every place. As a rule, having people trading isn't a problem. If, however, you then attack those, if you go back on your word, if you slaughter those people you have let in, as the Byzantines did, you are asking for people to maybe retaliate. So that the problem wasn't that they allowed the Latins to have trading privileges. The problem was when they run rampant and slaughter them in the streets, that the sons and the nephews of those slaughtered people might bring a fleet and take your city 20 years later, which is what they did.
Yeah, that is what happened. So, all right, good question from Chris. And then Jonathan asks, was King Baldwin IV not able to produce an heir due to his leprosy? Did he ever plan a marriage to try before his leprosy was too extreme?
No, because he basically he had leprosy by the age of, what was it, 7? I think this is one of Dee's things, but I think it's 7 or 8 was when William of Tyre identified that he had leprosy, or recognized that he was probably suffering from leprosy. And at that point, there was never any thought of forcing a woman into a marriage with a leper. That would have been anathema. Nor would any woman or have to consent. Latin Christianity requires consent on the part of the white woman and her family, of course. No, there was never any chance of him having a Christian wife.
Right.
And I don't think a king of a Latin Christian could have had a non-Christian wife.
Yeah, that's I agree fully with that. So let's go to Alexander. He asks, did Edward III plan to go on crusades after conquering France? And I have to admit, I don't really know that much about Edward III. Is that an area you're familiar with, Helena?
Again, I'm sure Rand is a greater aspect of that. As far as I know, no. Nor was it was Edward I. I mean, Edward I obviously did go to the Holy Land. Some of the nobles, Henry IV. Yes, Henry IV, famously, who takes down Richard II, had crusaded in the Baltic states. It was considered something that knights in Europe still did, to take part in the Crusades, either in Spain or in the Baltics. But a major campaign against the Holy Land was never seriously contemplated, to my knowledge, in England or in France after the 14th century. Well, I mean, not in this time.
And Sheila says that she bought your book. She's slowly reading it.
Oh,
I like that it's easy to understand. Thank you for that, Dr. Schrader. Well, that's awesome.
Thank you.
And Zytron says the same. He says he got your book and started reading it. So that's good news as well. So
yes, thank you again.
Okay, so Lambert has a question. Were the military orders within the Kingdom of Jerusalem only subject to internal within the order of justice if they committed a crime of any kind, even crimes against the laws of the kingdom?
Oh, great question, because that was debated. Obviously, the members of the orders said they were subject only to the discipline of their master and the Pope, and the kings of Jerusalem had a totally different attitude, as you can imagine. There's a famous incident where the kings of Jerusalem.
That's during Amalric's reign, right?
Correct. He makes the pact with the assassins, right?
Mm-hmm. That's what came to my mind.
And the Templars attack the assassin envoy and kill him. And Almaric tries to punish the Templars, and they don't allow him to bring them to justice. So it's ultimately, on the basis of that case, you'd say the Templars won the case. It's hard to know if another master, another king could have had a different outcome, but basically they did claim immunity from the laws of the kingdom. So did the Italians.
Yeah, I can't remember exactly what did happen with that episode. What was the Pope able to sort of enforce that, or did the Templars just kind of refuse to hand that guy over? Or
the Templars in the Holy Land refused to hand the culprits over. And as you're right, I think they refer it to the Pope, and I don't think anything ever comes of it.
Yeah. What's interesting is how little of that sort of conflict really seemed to come up. I mean, that's the one episode that came to my mind with that question, but I don't think you really see a lot of friction between the kings of Jerusalem and the military orders.
Of course, one of my key theses in the book that you got up there in the Holy Land in the Era of the Crusades is that one of the reasons the Crusader states failed is that they were ruled by absentee kings from the time that Yolanda married, or Isabella II married Frederick II Hohenstaufen. And the Hohenstaufen, in the entire time of their reign for 30 years, Friedrich himself was only in the Holy Land for 8 months, and neither of his son nor grandson ever set foot in the kingdom. And that this lack of central authority in the Holy Land was what made the second century of the Crusader states so different from the first century, where you had very strong central figures and strong kings. Even the kings that married in, like Fulk d'Anjou, came to the Holy Land and they were present in the kingdom. They fought for it, and they were a unifying figure. And that was absent in the second century. And that allowed the Templars and the Hospitallers to sort of run wild and fight with each other in the streets of Acre at the worst times, which might not have happened if there had been a king in the kingdom. And then there might have been a conflict, because if you'd had a strong king in the Holy Land who was angry with the orders fighting with each other, they might have come in conflict with him. But because there was no strong king, there was nobody enforcing sort of the position of the kingdom against the militant orders.
Okay, and Alexander asks, or what I think I may have missed. Okay, yeah. Did the kings of Jerusalem and other Crusader kingdoms marry into the royal houses of Western Christendom? And yeah, the answer to that would be not really the kings, but the queens did. I guess we could say, like, Queen Melisande married into.
Yeah, but it wasn't royalty.
Not the royal house. Yeah, count.
It's not. It's the second. It's you will have to get into the 13th century, 14th century Cyprus, where they marry into the Spanish, the House of Aragon.
Exactly. Okay. And then Jonah asks, did Richard the Lionheart intend to go back to Outremer and continue the recovery of the kingdom of Jerusalem after the Third Crusade? And the answer to that is yes, he did. In fact, he famously, I can't remember what exactly the circumstances were, but there was a point where I think it was when he had captured Philip's cousin, who was a bishop. I forget which bishop he was. I need to remember. That's right. Yeah. Beauvais. And that bishop was being held in prison by Richard, and a papal envoy came to Richard and to complain about this. And Richard pointed out, if it hadn't been for Philip and his family, I would have been able to have taken over the whole of Palestine. So that did come up. It seems pretty apparent that Richard did intend to go back. In fact, right after he got out of prison in the Holy Roman Empire, he sent a letter to Henry of Champagne, his nephew, who was the ruler in Jerusalem, and said, I'm going to come back as soon as I deal with Philip, basically.
There's also two things. When Champagne was asked to marry Isabella first, after the assassination of Conrad de Montferrat, Champagne did consult with Richard. I mean, there's two versions. One, of course, says that Richard basically chooses Champagne, which is absurd. It was the High Court that chose Champagne, but Champagne was somewhat reluctant. The sources agree that Champagne was somewhat reluctant because he really wanted to go home. And Richard promised, I will come back with a larger army and and secure the borders of your kingdom. And basically asked Champagne, do this, hold it, hold the fort, I will come back. And I think I agree with J. Stephen that Richard's commitment to the Holy Land was huge. And he showed that again and again. I think it's a pity that he went back at all. I think he should have married Isabella himself, except he already had a wife, and become king of Jerusalem.
That would have been interesting. That would have been very interesting.
Because it was his grandfather, right? No, his great grandfather. His great grandfather had come out to take the throne as Fulk d'Anjou. And so Richard, it would have been within the tradition. It would have been the same dynasty actually coming back. Had he not had just married, he would have been in a position to take over. And since he was going to lose to John anyways, now we know with hindsight, we know he was going to lose England to John anyways.
Well, yeah, I mean, it really was. Reading Gillingham's exhaustive biography of Richard's pretty interesting because I mean it was kind of it was a very close run thing. I mean, really, it's just the fact that Richard happened to get killed in what was kind of an accident. He was on the verge of breaking Philip's power completely. I mean, he had the Count of Flanders on his side. He had the Count of Bologna on his side. He had stripped Philip of all of his allies. I mean, I think that if Richard had lived longer, he would have conquered France. I mean, I think that was where things were headed. So Richard's early death is a huge impact. It has a huge impact on the direction of history, I think. So,
and yeah, that's another alternative. The thing I'm always impressed with is that he won a lot of those allies with diplomacy. It wasn't all about just winning battles. Richard was incredibly savvy and understood how, as you say, to pull people onto his side. The very fact his defense when he's tried by the Holy Roman Emperor and he turns a packed court onto his side. He must have been a brilliant orator.
Yeah, and that's from the German and French sources that we get that too. I mean,
I always say
yes.
Yeah.
Richard's enemies are his best witnesses throughout. I mean, whether it's the Muslims or that is an amazing episode, and it's clear that he made a lot of allies while he was in Germany. I mean, he was and then with the situation in France. I mean, one of the things Gillingham points out is that Richard was respected as somebody who kept his word and as somebody who could be relied upon, whereas men like Philip and John were not viewed that way. Yeah. And Gillingham points out that when Richard died, that was almost kind of the trigger for the Fourth Crusade to happen, because everybody was so distraught over the fact that everything was going to go to these vile men, Philip and John, that it kind of just made people lose heart, and which is interesting. I don't know. I that's the impression I get. I mean, Richard was widely admired, even in France. I mean, that's the reality. I mean, one of the first things that Philip tried to do when he got back was organize an invasion of Normandy, and the French nobles wouldn't do it because they said, we're not going to stab a crusader in the back while he's over there doing this. So pretty interesting.
Well, and obviously the Duke of Burgundy and the Crusaders who stayed when Philip left were appalled that Philip left. That didn't stop them from still fighting with Richard, but that's sort of the inevitable squabbles of powerful people, amongst themselves. But it wasn't as though Philip had a lot of support when he withdrew from the crusade.
Exactly. Yeah.
It didn't make him popular.
Yeah, I think that the way that period is portrayed is so kind of distorted. I mean, when you really get down to the facts of it, it's this idea that Richard was kind of just this bullish, kind of overly aggressive ruler, and Philip was just he was the more reasonable one. I mean, I just think that's just totally wrong. Philip was the one who kind of was driven by his hatred of Richard, and but I mean, between Philip and John, I mean, John, who kills his nephew Arthur. you just have some
Yeah,
nasty
it's hard
personalities
to
there.
defend John. It's very hard to defend John, but I have to say, with Philip, actually did a lot of good for France. He left France in a much stronger position than it had been when he took it over, which means that, you know, there's this, he wasn't, I don't think it's not easy to like Philip, but a historian has to be fair and say what he did was he broke the backs of, he threw the Plantagenets out and took control of France again. And that's the bottom line of his record. And we may not like his methods.
Yeah.
It might not have been possible if Richard had lived, but he did leave France much stronger than it had been when he took it over.
Yeah, that's fair enough. I mean, he created kind of a new entity. I mean, you know, I do think, you know, once you've got John in the picture, you can see why people ultimately preferred to go with Philip, which is kind of what happened. Eventually, a lot of these guys just kind of, you know, the various counts and dukes sort of just went with Philip because, you know, nobody trusted John.
The alternative was,
right. So, which is understandable. I mean, John was strikingly vile. I mean, when you get down to it. So, okay.
Never seen any revisionism.
Yeah, no, yeah.
Never been rehabilitated.
No, I mean, the whole thing of him murdering his nephew is the thing that really gets me. And I mean, that seems to be what happened. He seems to have killed this young man, Arthur, and that's just beyond vile. I mean, anyway, so let's see. Messi, King of Kings, says, was there a plan? I'm not quite sure what that means, but was there a plan from Reynald to steal Muhammad's body? I've never seen anything like that. I think that seems more like fable and legend. It was a political raid, is what it was.
Sure. In fact, I would say that is Muslim propaganda. That is what they said to make people angry. That is not even nobody at the time. Renaud de Chardonnau's Red Sea raids were definitely there to disrupt pilgrim traffic, but mostly they were to force Saladin to stop his attack on Aleppo and turn back. Because the Crusader kingdom, my enemy's enemy is my friend. The Crusader kingdoms in Aleppo were at that point cooperating with one another, and it was served their interests to stop, to make it was a strategic move with the benefit for those engaged in it with a lot of loot. But stealing Muhammad's body would just rile up everybody against you and make it harder to do anything. That is, as I'm going to be saying, I'm fairly confident that would have been what the Muslims said to get the people angry and to get them behind their efforts to stop them. Or it was just the panic of the local people saying, he's going to, you know, this is what's happening. They're striking so close to Mecca. What if, you know, one or the other. But there's no evidence whatsoever that Chatillon or Baldwin IV, who was probably behind the raids, had any interest in that kind of a sacrilege.
I agree. And Tom asks, did any of the First Crusade nobles ever fight alongside El Cid?
That's for you.
Well, yeah, that would have to be a no, because El Cid died while the First Crusade was in progress. He died 10 days before they took Jerusalem, 5 days before they took Jerusalem.
Wow.
But several important leaders in the First Crusade fought alongside Alfonso the Battler of Aragon when he was conquering Zaragoza. In fact, they were kind of charged with siege operations. They must have, you know, gained some experience or something like that. Gaston of Béarn, I believe, was one of them. And maybe William of Montpellier, I think, was the other. These were guys from the south of France, but they were a part of Alfonso of Aragon's crusade in Zaragoza. And of course, Alfonso of Aragon, he himself as a young man fought with El Cid. So, you know, there's a connection there. Okay.
I hadn't realized El Cid died so close to of course, it would have taken another month for the news to get back, but what a thought.
It's kind of picturesque. Yeah. He dies in Valencia 5 days before, while the Crusaders are taking Jerusalem. So it's kind of a picturesque, you know, element there.
Poignant. Yeah.
Let's see. Tom says, what happened to the Order of the Holy Sepulcher after Jerusalem was taken by Saladin? That I don't really know, honestly, Tom. You've kind of stumped me on that one. That's the priest who took care of the Holy Sepulcher, right, Helena? Is that what he's talking about?
I'm questioning, because the canons, as far as I know, the canons of the Holy Sepulcher, there was the convent around the Holy Sepulcher. I didn't think it was ever considered an order, but they left the city at the same time. They could pay their ransom. So when Saladin took this, they didn't take it by storm. He negotiated with Balin de Ibelin. Ibelin organized the ransom payments, which the canons could clearly pay. The ransom payments were way above what a normal workman could pay, but it was not above what a canon could pay. They had access to the treasury of the Holy Sepulcher. And we know that they left peacefully in the convoy that went north towards Tyre, which was a city that was still held by the Latin Christians, protected by Ibelin and his knights. And then once Acre was recaptured by in the Third Crusade, by the forces of the Third Crusade, they established themselves in Accra, and they continued to call themselves the Canon of the Holy Sepulchre, and they reestablished their scriptorium, and they continued to produce books, illustrated books, manuscripts in their scriptorium there. So they survived. Essentially, they survived.
Okay. So we're getting close to the end here, guys. I'm going to go ahead and pick a couple final questions. I'm going to look for people who have not.
These are great questions, by the way. We're getting better and better questions, aren't we?
We're getting a lot of good questions, but we always get a lot of really good questions. So I appreciate that, guys. Appreciate everybody participating and being a part of the stream. But like I was saying, let's find some people who have not gotten a chance to ask yet. So this is King Henry I himself is here. So he asks, was the reign of Fulk and Melisende a successful one? I know that he had given up his county of Anjou to his son Geoffrey, but I know little of his life in the kingdom of Jerusalem. I'll let you start on that one, Helena.
Well, it was a very significant reign. There was a lot went on. Buy my book. Fulk was a very strong king, but he was ruled jointly with Melisende. It was the reign which established the rights of women in the Crusader states to be ruling queens. He tried to sideline her early on. He was opposed by the church and by the leading noblemen in Outremer, which means he was forced to back down, and Melisende was restored to her position as joint monarch. Together, there's an excellent article. I'm thinking it was. I'm sorry. We don't have time. I can go and check it out, but there's been an excellent article which examines the reign and how there was a corporate kingship which worked extremely effectively, because Fulk was basically concerned with foreign policy and the military. And whenever he was out defending the kingdom and attacking Aleppo and doing things out there, Melisende could maintain the basic government of the kingdom. And because she was a ruling queen, she could do everything. She didn't need his permission. She didn't need his signature. She could rule, and it worked brilliantly, because that meant he could concentrate on defending the kingdom and be away from the administrative apparatus, and it still functioned perfectly. And it was, whether it was charters or it was giving away, patronage or whatever, or repairing defenses, she managed that. And it's pointed out that this model worked brilliantly, and it was considered a very successful reign. Short, but after some initial tensions between the two of them.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree. I think that they were both very effective rulers. Melisende is, pretty clearly a remarkable queen in the kingdom's history. I remember when we had Dr. Donachie on once, and we were talking about this, and he said that he thinks that the conflict between Fulk and Melisende is overemphasized by William of Tyre as a way to kind of provide a good read. It's kind of basically what he said, which is kind of interesting. Okay. So I think that's, I mean, it definitely took place. I mean, there was definitely an attempt to oust her in some way or sideline her. But I do think that's kind of interesting to kind of keep that in mind sometimes, that some of these internal conflicts within the kingdom might not have been as violent as we like to think sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, that's very valid point, just even. I also think the fact that they got along afterwards suggests it couldn't have been all that bad. The
Right.
same
Yeah.
thing, the same thing with her conflict with her son, with Baldwin III. It's described as, tearing the country apart, and the next thing you know, she's back in court. She's in the high court. She's negotiating treaties, and it's like, wait a minute, what happened here? She wasn't sidelined. She hasn't been locked up. She hasn't abdicated. She's still governing. So I agree. Maybe the descriptions of the conflict have been very overblown, because the record the record that we have of joint charters and what happens afterwards suggests that there wasn't any major breach.
Yeah, definitely
So,
true.
very good
After the little spat between her and Baldwin III, she definitely remained a very important part of the government. So that is pretty relevant. And then this last question here, this is actually directly related to your book, which is kind of nice. This is from Walker. He says, I'm reading your book and you bring up a point where the sale of slaves contributed to the downfall of the Crusader states via trained Mamluks. Was greed the overall downfall in your opinion? That's kind of a interesting question.
Yeah, it's great. I actually think it was the absentee. The real issue was the absentee kings, that there was no powerful monarchs in the kingdom to sort out the inherent tensions in the air, and the inherent fractionalism that exists in any political entity. But greed is never, too much greed is always bad for any kingdom.
Yeah.
Little.
Excellent point. And yeah, we got a couple other people talking about how they got your book. So John says he got your book. He's halfway through it. And Philophus, your book came in the mail the other day. So that's pretty good. So
thank you. Yeah. Good to get some. Right. Everybody, please write reviews. Or at least leave a good rating if you like it. Even if you don't want to write a whole review, it's enough to just put some sort of a rating on Amazon, because it really makes a difference to the algorithms if it has a lot of reviews, particularly if they're good reviews or good ratings.
Yeah, everybody do stop by the Amazon page. It's linked in the description below, and you can give Helena's book a review. And yeah, with that, I think we will close down for today. So everybody, thanks for being here. This has been an excellent stream. Glad we got to kind of kick things off again this Tuesday. So I'll be back next Tuesday, or actually, I think next Tuesday is the 4th. So I'm most likely going to stick to that, and then we'll get going the following Tuesday. So, okay. Well, everybody, Helena, thanks for being here. I really appreciate you joining us as usual.
I love it. And thank everybody, all of you, for buying my book.
All right. And we will see you all next time. And until then.